For the past 18 months, I've been working on recreating this dress made by my great-great-grandmother in 1897. I've shared the math, engineering, and artistry required to recreate this beautiful little dress. And now we are finally on the last piece of the puzzle. In this video, I will be sharing the process that I used to create the bodice. This soft, almost cloud-like bodice is the second and most complex piece for the Alice dress. In this tutorial, I'll guide you through each step. This is surprisingly complex, but hopefully I'll be able to help you through the process. I also have a written tutorial available on my website, as well as all of the pattern pieces that you need in order to make one of these yourself. You're going to need at least 7 yards of fabric for a small to medium size, and at least 8 yards of fabric for anything larger than that. First, we're going to go through the bodice pattern pieces. Make sure that before you do any mock-ups, you have all of your 1890s underpinnings ready before making a mock-up, including chemise, corset, corset cover, and bust improver. These make a big difference for the fit of this garment, specifically the lining. You can follow the link in the description below to find the Alice bodice pattern. You can input all of your measurements. If you're having trouble understanding what the measurements mean, you can look up the waist pattern from the Keystone Jacket and Dress Cutter. This pattern is basically exactly the same as the lining, and you can just use that one for your mock-ups if you need to, so you don't have to print out everything. By the way, this and nearly all other patterns on Drafting Dynamically do not contain seam allowance. The edge of the pattern piece is your seam. I recommend temporarily leaving about 1 inch for your allowance unless stated otherwise, just in case you need to make any adjustments along the way. The lining pieces should all be cut out of a light but sturdy plain cotton. The front and back yokes and bodice pieces should be of your outer fabric. The front bodice lining on both sides should have an extra 2 inches on the center front, not including seam allowance, to allow for the button closure. On the original, this edge is on the selvage. The buttons are going to be placed along the curved line of the center front. The yokes and outer bodice pieces should be on the fold. Both yoke pieces and the back outer piece are oriented so that if the text is right side up, the center is the vertical line. The center line on the outer bodice is at an angle, however, when you line it up with your fabric, it should be straight up and down. The outer edge of the front yoke pattern sometimes gets wonky. Part of the way from the shoulder to the center, it should get about 1/4 inch narrower than wider again. Smooth out the curve if necessary. Next, we're going to go through the sleeve pattern pieces. All 3 parts of this sleeve will be made out of the outer fabric. The slim sleeve pieces should also be cut out of the lining fabric. On the original, the sleeves of the outer fabric are straightest at the elbow. The slim sleeve pattern is a little bit odd. The inner back piece is for the opposite side as the outer front, since the shared inner elbow edge is a seam. While this doesn't really matter while cutting, it can throw you off when labeling the sides and making sure you have the right piece. There's no lining or support for the sleeve puff. Cut the puff out on the fold on the large vertical line. Next, we need to cut out the collar pattern pieces. I recommend using the same 1 1/4 inch height for the collar. When you have it any wider than that, you start having a few issues with the outer collar piece. This outer collar is quite interesting. I've never been able to find a pattern similar to it. It's this almost circular piece that is attached in an interesting way. If you know of a collar pattern, especially from this era, of something similar to this, please let me know. I would love to have it as a reference. Now we're going to start some pattern modifications. There are several pieces of this bodice that either have patterns that need to be slightly altered, or they are made from other pieces. The collar lining piece needs to be altered slightly. D to F is the center front, while the shorter B to A is center back. However, the bodice opens on the left shoulder. First, make a mirror copy of the collar lining. We're going to line it up against the back, so that we have one long piece. I'm going to show you what this looks like next to this. This is center front. And we want to look at it in this direction because it's going to be right side up. So what we're going to do this is the shoulder, this is the back. So we put the back, line that up here, cut it here, and put it around on the other side. So to do that, we're going to mark this line. Okay. Okay. So now this is center front to the shoulder, and then around to the back. There are a few additional pieces from the bodice pattern that you'll need as well. These are the two that you need for the lining fabric. The inner front yoke lining gives the front yoke and front bodice pieces something solid to attach the gathers to, since the front bodice is set away from the lining piece. This piece is based on the front lining. The lower edge is roughly an inch above the bust line. Put center front on the fold. This piece goes across the whole front. Include enough space to turn under roughly half an inch. On the original, this lower edge is covered with an on-grain tape, not stretch. The buttonhole hiding placket covers up the lining buttons, only where the inner front yoke lining does not cover them. Measure the length of the bodice lining center front from 2 inches above the bust line down to the bottom. The finished piece will be 1.25 inches wide folded over with finished edges, so the pattern piece should be about 2.5 inches plus seam allowance. Next are the extra bodice pattern pieces that you'll need for the outer fabric. First, the opening facing. This piece prevents the lining fabric from being visible at the opening and gives some support to the outer front bodice piece. Trace a line 1.25 inches left of the far right edge of the front lining piece, along the armhole and down the side seam. The two shoulder-facing pieces finish the opening. They are each a simple rectangle, the width of the shoulder, and 1.25 inches wide. For the neckline finish, you will need a short length to cover the raw edge of the neckline along the left front lining. This should end up being roughly 3/8 of an inch wide. On the original, this is done on grain, not on bias. For the waistband, this is a little over 1.25 times your waist measurement, since it will overlap. Make sure that you include a little bit extra for the buttonhole closure. The waistband ends up being about 1.5 inches wide, so the pattern piece should be at least 3 inches wide plus seam allowance. The original waistband had a lot of damage on both the bodice and the skirt, so be sure to also cut one out of interfacing. We're also going to need a sleeve cuff facing. Line up the ends of the two slim sleeve pieces at the wrist on the long seam. This facing should be about 1 inch wide at the wrist. You are also going to need waist buttons, 4 of them, 9 buttons for the lining, about 10 millimeters wide. You're going to need 6 hook and bars. You're also going to need some 1.5 to 3 inch lace for the neckline and cuffs. And now we can actually get started sewing this together. First, we're going to make the front lining pieces. Make the 2 front darts on the front lining pieces. On the original, all raw edges of lining pieces are visible on the inside, not hidden between the lining and the outer fabric. This is primarily because the original outer fabric is so thin that you would be able to see the raw seams from the outside. Press darts away from each other. Mark a line 1 inch from the line from end to 10. This should contain your buttonhole and button curve for the front center, without it straying too close to either side of the buttonhole support. You may need to modify this slightly. Mark a line 1.25 inches out from that line to give you a nice finished edge on the inside of this button support. Turn and press this edge, then turn and press the whole buttonhole support at the edge 1 inch away from end to 10. Top stitch this section at 1/8 of an inch or less from the finished inside edge. Next, sew together the back, and side lining pieces along their long edges. Press center back open if it was not on the fold, and side panels out towards the sides. Next, if necessary, trim the bottom of the inner front yoke lining to make it straight across. Make sure it is a little longer, at least 3/4 of an inch, than your front yoke at center front. Turn twice and press a hem about 1/2 inch wide on the bottom edge. Next, we get into the closure facings. Find the closure facing for the lining side, which is going to be on the left front. Fold and press in the inner long seam allowance, clip as necessary. Top stitch it down to the front lining on the finished side, not the wrong side. Fold and press one long edge of a shoulder facing piece. Top stitch it to the shoulder of the same front lining piece. Fold and press one long edge of the neckline finish piece. Stitch this on like bias tape. On the original, the inside is finished by hand, not top stitched. Next, we'll add the closure facings on the front yoke lining. Fold and press one long edge of the shoulder facing piece. Top stitch to the shoulder of the inner front yoke lining. Do not stitch along the shoulder seam line. This needs to be open for later. You can actually leave the shoulder piece off until later if you would like to. Find the closure facing for the outer side. Fold and press in the inner long seam allowance. Top stitch it down to the inner front yoke lining on the inside. Start about an inch below the shoulder seam and give yourself enough of a tail on this end to finish the stitching by hand after the outer bodice pieces have been attached. I continued this top stitching the rest of the way down the facing, though on the original this was not top stitched, it was felled to the outer piece by hand. Next, we start on the many gathered pieces of this bodice, and we're going to start with the back yoke. Run a gathering thread along the top and bottom of the back yoke. Stitch the shoulders of the back yoke to the shoulders of the back bodice lining group. The shoulders of the yoke will not be as long as the shoulders of the lining. Carefully arrange the gathers at the neckline and stitch down. Arrange the gathers at the bottom so that it all goes nicely, and stitch down as well. The raw edge will be covered by the outer bodice piece later. Next, we're going to do the front yoke. Again, run a gathering thread along the top and bottom of the front yoke. The outer edge of the front yoke pattern sometimes gets a little bit wonky, as I mentioned earlier. It shouldn't get any narrower than 1/4 to 1/2 inch less than the shoulder. Stitch the shoulders of the front yoke to the shoulders of the inner front yoke lining. The shoulders of the yoke will not be as long as the shoulders of the lining. Make sure on the closure side to pull the shoulder facing piece down so that it is not caught. Now we're going to put together the rest of the front bodice. We need to end up with a finished edge 5/8 of an inch wide to allow for the ruffle. Turn and press the top of your front bodice piece to create this edge. Run a gathering thread 5/8 of an inch from this pressed edge to both hold the ruffle closed and prepare to gather the bodice. Sew the front bodice and the inner front yoke lining together along the closure facing, right sides together, to create a nice edge along the left arm side and the side seam edge. Now finish the closure by tucking together the shoulder of the front and the shoulder of the inner front yoke lining and stitching it together by hand. You should now have a fully enclosed edge for your closure. Flatline the other shoulder to the shoulder of the inner front yoke lining. The raw edges are supposed to be seen on the inside when we attach this to the back lining section later. Now arrange the gathers on the top of the bodice piece. The sections near the shoulders should have a little bit of gathering, but not as much as the center. Mark 4 to 5 inches on either side of the bottom of the front piece, coming in from the underarm seams. These parts are only the tiniest bit gathered, with nearly all of the gathering at center front. We'll gather it when we add the waistband later. Next, we do similar steps for the back bodice. Again, we need to end up with a finished edge 5/8 of an inch wide to allow for the ruffle. Flatline the shoulders to the back bodice lining. Mark 4 to 5 inches on either side of the bottom of the bodice piece, coming in from the underarm seams. These parts are only the tiniest bit gathered, with nearly all of the gathering at center back. Next, we're going to be connecting the back to the front. Sew the left front lining piece with all the facing to the back bodice, right sides together, along the shoulder and side seams. Press these seams towards the back to help set the front lining a little bit lower. Flatline the front bodice with all the gathered outer sections to the other front lining piece along the neckline, shoulder, arm side, and side seam. Sew the whole front bodice section to the back bodice along the shoulder and side seams. On this side, press these seams open. Now is a good time to try this bodice on and double check the fit, especially the lower edge. I think this is a pretty cool shot to help explain exactly how this bodice works, which is just, it's so much fun to see it fitting. So we have buttons up the front, well, not yet, but we will. And this seam matches up with where the waistband on my skirt is. And once we have this buttoned up center front, then we take this piece and we're going to hook and eye it up to this seam and under at this seam. Add the buttonholes to the lining. They're closer together at the bottom than they are at the top. You can subtly follow the curved center front line, although make sure you don't get too close to the edge. Take the buttonhole placket, top stitch along the edge of the buttonhole area, covering the lower buttonholes up to just beyond where the front inner yoke lining begins to hide the buttons from view through the front outer bodice. Next, we work on the sleeves. On the original, the lining and outer fabric are flat lined and treated as a single piece. Stitch the pairs together along the long seam, right sides together. Trim seam allowance and press open. On the sleeve facing pieces, fold and press in the inner edge, not at the wrist. Stitch the sleeve facing to its matching sleeve along the wrist, not the sides yet, right sides together. If you wanted to sew the cuff lace into the sleeve, this is where you'd place it. However, on the original, it had the lace tacked into the inside of the wrist, probably so that it could be easily removed for washing or for reuse. The edge of the facing will be at an angle from the edge of the sleeve. Sew along the short seam of the sleeve, right sides together, continuing through the facing. This keeps the raw edge of the facing hidden underneath it. Fold facing down to the inside and tack down the edge by hand. Next, stitch the sleeve puffs right sides together along the short seam. Run a gathering thread around both the upper and lower edges of each puff. The lower edge is the simpler, more exaggerated curve, and the top has the concave sections. To figure out the alignment, take the slim sleeve and line it up with the armhole. I've noticed that the sleeve fits best when the long seam is lined up with the seam between the back and side back bodice lining pieces. Mark where the shoulder seam and the seam between the side and front are. From the mark of the side seam, travel down the sleeve about an inch and mark. This is where the lower edge of the puff will sit at the seam of the puff. At the shoulder seam mark, the puff will fold back on itself about 3 to 4 inches. Measure the width of the puff at the widest point and subtract 6 inches. Then take that distance on the slim sleeve from the shoulder seam mark. Draw a smooth line around the slim sleeve, meeting at both these points. Gather the lower edge of the puff to the slim sleeve along this line, right sides together. The puff is mostly evenly gathered here, except for about 2 inches either side of the side seam where it's only gathered a little. Sew this down. Next, gather the upper edge of the puff. This edge will be flat-lined to the slim sleeve. Next, ease the sleeve into the armhole, lining up the long seam of the slim sleeve with the seam between back and side back. These raw edges are all visible on the inside of the garment. Press the seam allowance towards the sleeve. Next, we add the collar. This outer collar is definitely the piece I am least sure about. So feel free to modify it a little, especially if your fabric is a little bit heavier. Thinner fabrics will probably look closer to the original. First, flatline the collar interfacing to the collar lining. Run a gathering thread along the outer collar along both the inside and outside. First, gather the inner line of the collar to the top edge of collar lining. Since you're opening up a circle, it is going to feel a little bit odd. Lay the collar out on a flat surface. Stretch outer collar over the lining and pin it in place so it's even before we try gathering. This is to prevent the folds from twisting or bunching at the wrong place. If you try to gather it evenly, it is not going to look quite right. It's going to look a little bit twisted and strange. Later, this lower section will be gathered up to meet the bottom of the lining, but for now, stretch it out as needed so that you can see where the gathers want to be. Place some temporary pad stitching or use a very wide and long zigzag stitch to hold these starting gathers in place along the collar lining. Carefully pin the outer collar to the bodice. Ideally, the bottom of the collar should match up to the bottom of the neckline finish tape. Sew the lower edge of the collar to the bodice, remove the pad stitching, and sew down the inner edge of the collar lining to the bodice, so that all of the raw edges are hidden inside the collar. Add the waistband, making sure that the gathers at the bottom of the bodice pieces are primarily in the centers we marked earlier. Add hook and bar closures along the closure, 1 on the collar, 2 on the shoulder, and 2 under the arm along the side sleeve. On the original, there were 4 buttons on the waistband of the bodice with matching buttonholes on the skirt. Add buttons for the bodice lining, and you are all done. I am so excited with how this dress turned out. The soft cream cotton with blue flowers is absolutely beautiful, and the lace is a perfect match. If you make one of these dresses, please tag me so that I can see it. I'm very excited to share the pattern and instructions so more of us can enjoy wearing this lovely 1890s gown. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.